I was over here clapping and everything. I think I almost banged on this table.
Everybody riot, organized chaos, nobody quiet. We gon' try a seance. Communication and communion with the world's greatest icon. Station as a human, yet he's listening to my song. Hype join. This that no nigga with the bass and the bang. Make it do, yo. Hit you with the five elements like five elephants. Let him know I'm relevant. I'm heaven sent, telling him we're from a whole nother galaxy. I'm actually born from the static sea. Ass to be crazy, I'm trying to be amazing. Next big thing kinda has a nice ring. Bada boom, bada bing. You love it when I go off when it's all out and it's so awesome. I get it cause I am from where the stars from. I'm Martian, the boogie down's the motherland. Cool arcs the overlord and we are just a cover band. I love the land I'm in, but everyone's opinionated, insinuating that we're...
All right, and once again with the hard cut and the first take that went short, we are live here on HamiltonRadio.net, channel HR2. I am your host, John Brecco, and it's very, very good to be back here in the studio for this show. I'm very, very excited to do this because we have on a fellow John, a fellow wrestling fan, a fellow commentator. I'm very, very excited to bring a guy like this on. He's a past and present radio personality. He's done commentary for the National Wrestling Alliance, Tokyo Pops FMW, and the Urban Wrestling Alliance. He's done a lot for pro wrestling and a lot for radio in general. That's why I'm very excited. So we got right here with us on the line, straight up, John Watanabe. I hope I said that right. John, how you doing, my man? Are you good?
Yes, Mr. John Brecco. This is John Watanabe coming straight up at you. I am blessed and I'm thankful that you asked me to be a part of the roundtable. I also want to thank Ruben for operating the board because I realize that board ops don't get the respect that they deserve sometimes. So I thank you all for having me on, and I look forward to this discussion because, John, you kind of, when I talk to you, you kind of remind me of a younger version of me because you're an aspiring broadcaster, you're young, and you had dreams of building up your resume with more on-air broadcasting credits, and you wanted to be a pro wrestling announcer, and thank God I've been there, done that. So this should be an interesting discussion with lots of sharing.
Hey, man, I'm doing the absolute best I can right now, you know, with announcing football games, and definitely shout out to Ruben. I got to be with you on that. He's the one who actually helped me get started here. So I appreciate everything he's done for me. And you know what? I don't tell him that enough. I normally just mess with him and try to get him to the point where he stops laughing, but he never does, which is probably a good thing. But anyways, the first thing that I wanted to ask you, and I ask this to everybody, you know, during the time we're going through, how you doing with just everything going on? I try to check up on all my guests. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. I presume that you're talking about this certain virus thing that everybody around the world is going through.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank God my wife April and I are doing fine. We're both healthy. We're both still working here in Southern California. My wife April, she's a special education teacher, and of course lately she's been doing all her work online, but you know, she and her colleagues are learning to adapt, and we're still healthy and still working. I'm still on the air full time at K-Wave Christian Radio 107.9 in Southern California and our sister stations covering Las Vegas, San Diego, and Barstow. So I'm doing well, and well, I just want to say from my own conviction, from my own walk in the faith in my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, Jesus did say that we would go through things like pestilence and famines and various other trials and tribulations that he predicted 2,000 years ago that are happening now as we speak, shortly before what I believe will be his second coming soon. But he promised that he will be faithful, protecting his faithful remnant. So I have no fear. I trust in the Lord. So therefore I have no fear.
All you can really ask for at the end of the day is to, you know, wake up the next morning, have your health, be able to do what you love. And that's really the end of it. So I'm glad to hear that. And the first thing that I really want to ask you, and you had me thinking about this, you know, when you said you reminded me of yourself, when you were trying to be a pro wrestling announcer when you were younger. I want to ask because you told me that you auditioned for, some of the commentating jobs you got. So, what was the first match you commentated when you were doing the audition? Do you remember?
I do not remember. Well, at both auditions for both of my on-air host and commentary jobs, in case you don't know, this year, in the year 2020, I am celebrating the 20th anniversary of two nationally seen pro wrestling series that made their debut back in the year 2000. One was the Tokyo Pop presentation of FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling in Japan. Tokyo Pop, in case you don't know, they mainly specialize in Japanese animation, anime, manga, and I've noticed, John, that you were involved in a manga club in college. Is that correct?
I was. That's true. You did your homework.
Yeah, and I admire broadcasters who do show prep and homework ahead of time, which you have done, which I'm thankful for. And, okay, so FMW presented by Tokyo Pop, the English language version, that's one of them. And the other league was the Urban Wrestling Alliance, which was syndicated nationally in major markets, mainly on UPN TV stations. So those were the two leagues that I did hosting and play-by-play announcing for, that I auditioned for, and I eventually got the jobs for. Tokyo Pop's FMW, I learned about that audition through an entertainment publication called Backstage West, where they advertise, entertainment industry job auditions. And the Urban Wrestling Alliance, I got that audition through my then theatrical talent agent, who was John McCormick from the Morgan Agency in Hollywood, California. And I cannot recall at either audition what particular match I did play-by-play for when I was just auditioning, who the participants were or anything. Well, for Tokyo Pop's FMW, it was some Japanese wrestling match, obviously. Urban Wrestling Alliance, it was footage of some Urban Wrestling Alliance wrestlers in training who were just signed up to be a part of the promotion. It was a brand-new startup promotion. I can't remember, but hey, I got the job, and I do remember that at both auditions, I was waiting in the waiting room at both, and I heard a bunch of guys screaming and yelling, but from what I could tell, they had no knowledge of wrestling whatsoever. So I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to audition for these jobs because I had both the knowledge of wrestling, being a lifelong fan, going back to the 1970s, and also having all this experience that I thank God I have in professional stage performing, radio broadcasting, of course, emceeing at live events, stage work, some TV commercial work, corporate videos. I combined all this knowledge and experience, channeled it into these two wrestling announcing gigs, and I thank God I got them, and I'm thankful that they're still talked about today.
Mm-hmm. No, it's definitely a huge accomplishment to be able to, do broadcasting live for pro wrestling shows like that, so you should be proud of yourself. If you can, though, tell us a little bit about the promotions, because when I did my homework on these two, they're two very, very different promotions, so that's what struck me the most, about you doing both of these wrestling gigs. So tell us a little bit about the promotions, if you could.
Absolutely, yeah. They, like you said, John, they were both different in approach. However, they both have one thing in common. Again, both of these promotions, the Urban Wrestling Alliance TV show and FMW presented by Tokyo Pop on home videos and DVDs, they were both the beginning of a new era where they involved script writers, screenwriters. I mean, back in the 1970s when I grew up as a wrestling fan, wrestling was shown on TV in, plain-looking setups with bare-bones TV production values and no script writers. The play-by-play guy just called the action in front of it, hold for hold with, nothing scripted out ahead of time.
Yeah.
But with the Tokyo Pop FMW promotion and Urban Wrestling Alliance, they both hired screenwriters to write out scripts for the on-camera talent, which was quite a change, but now it's a given nowadays because I think nowadays a lot of wrestling fans know that WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, they hire a staff of writers from Hollywood. I think that's a given now. But back then it was a relatively new concept, but it's grown more and more toward that direction where wrestling has become more and more of a Hollywood-style TV production with all this heavy production, with the actual in-ring wrestling become, comparatively less of a component because the wrestling itself is like a small part of the whole picture with, makeup and wardrobe and, fancy sets, fancy music. So I think FMW and Urban Wrestling Alliance, they were both a part of the change that were a part of the influence into the sports entertainment that we see nowadays. And what was your question again?
No, I just wanted to know if you could tell me a little bit about Tokyo Pop, FMW, and the Urban Wrestling Alliance, because they're both very different.
That's right. Right, I'm sorry, what these promotions were all about. Well, Tokyo Pop, as I said, they specialized in, Japanese manga, Japanese comics books, which are sold in, like, bookstores, and they decided to branch out a bit, so Tokyo Pop added new products to their line, so to speak. They did an independent movie, they did this TV show about cars, and they decided to present wrestling for the American audience in English language, and in this case, it was FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling. And I don't know whose idea it was to hire scriptwriters, Hollywood scriptwriters, but they decided to do that. I think the Tokyo Pop people or somebody from there figured, this is a Japanese import. Nobody here in America knows about Japanese wrestling, so we could just make up our own storylines, make up bios of these Japanese wrestlers that nobody knows. But when I did the first series of FMW wrestling videos, and my first co-host was a stand-up comic and actor named Eric Geller, we read off of scripts word per word, and we read these made-up storylines, including Terry Funk was a fighter pilot and parachute artist from New Jersey, which is totally false. I think any smart wrestling fan or even casual wrestling fan knows that. And these first FMW videos got a horrible reaction from wrestling fans. Why are these guys making up these BS stories? Why are they making up these lines about these wrestlers who we know that are not true? And so they decided to scrap that approach, and they brought on a new color commentator for me, Dan the Mouth Lavransky, from Live Audio Wrestling in Toronto, Canada. And by the way, I was talking to a wrestling fan not long ago, and he credits Dan Lavransky for being one of the early unsung heroes of what we now call modern-day pro wrestling podcasting, talking about wrestling. And so he was brought on, Dan Lavransky, and we did non-scripted videos where we brought our own knowledge of wrestling, and we talked about the real history and the original storylines behind these FMW matches from Japan that we're recalling, and they got a better response. And I feel better about the videos I did with Dan Lavransky that were non-scripted. And not only were these Tokyo Pop FMW videos and DVDs shown or sold nationwide at video stores back in the day, and some of them made the Billboard charts. They were top sellers on Billboard sports video list, but also they were shown for years on a Canadian cable TV network, the Fight Network, and they were shown for years on the Fight Network throughout Canada for at least 10 years or so, I think, and that's why to this day, when I look at LinkedIn and certain wrestling sites, there are still wrestling fans from Canada who remember my FMW work, and I'm thankful for that, and they've complimented me too. As for the Urban Wrestling Alliance, it was syndicated on major market stations, mainly on UPN stations back then, and it was a startup. It was a brand new promotion where they combined pro wrestling with hip-hop music culture, and they hired independent wrestlers from all over the country, some from Northern California, some from the northeastern states, some from Southern California, from all over the place, and they brought these wrestlers on, and it had like a hip-hop feel to it, and they had these characters on the show like a commissioner, the commissioner's assistant, and they scripted out lines for them for backstage skits. So that was a part of the Hollywood scriptwriters process for that show. And it was a startup, and I could tell that the Urban Wrestling Alliance, it didn't appeal necessarily to the most hardcore fans, because when we did TV tapings at some of these venues like the historic Grand Olympic Auditorium in downtown Los Angeles, also the Barker Hangar in Santa Monica, where they've done the Nickelodeon award shows, I could tell the people in attendance, they didn't like say "woo" whenever somebody chopped a guy. So you can tell they weren't exactly hardcore. Okay.
Yeah, no,
But
not
it
at
was
all.
different. It was unique, and it combined a hip hop music feel. And on each episode of the UWA Urban Wrestling Alliance, we showed a music video at the end with established rap music artists like Jay-Z and others, and these videos combine the music videos with highlights of that show's episode, wrestling highlights.
Yeah.
So I thought it was unique, and in some ways I thought it was like a foreshadowing of the sports entertainment that you see today, because
Yeah.
a lot of today's product, it involves, hit music and a lot of acting backstage with scripted lines. So I think that we were a part of the early stages of that process in TV wrestling that you see today.
I agree with that 100%. When you look at the Urban Wrestling Alliance, as you mentioned, a lot of their stuff is based on, the characters that you see. It's not really so much about the wrestling. They kind of go with that Hollywood presentation, the backstage skits, and, stuff like that. They really focus on the characters, I feel like. You got a lot more of that than you did wrestling. And I think that's where a lot of people go with today. They love to go with the story rather than the wrestling. And that's one way that I believe it's changed. But as you mentioned, you've been a wrestling fan since the 70s. And I was born in 95. So a lot of the stuff from the 70s, I never saw it. So I wanted to ask you this as a wrestling fan, how much do you feel that wrestling overall, since you've been a fan for all the years that, you've been into wrestling, how much has it changed overall? Talk to me about some of it.
Well, I feel that big picture wise, I think that wrestling has changed going back to the early 1900s. And I think even during the 1970s, some old fans then thought, oh, I wish wrestling would go back to the way it was during the 1930s. So it's constantly changing with, new generations wanting, something different. And I understand that, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate both. I appreciate old school and some of the current stuff as well, realizing that sometimes things change, just like technology changes in broadcasting, and there are changes in radio broadcasting as well. I accept that. Well, my first memories of watching it as a fan when I was a kid, I watched it here and there, but I think the first time I was really hooked on it was in 1974 when I was visiting Japan, because I had relatives who lived in Japan at the time, and that's where I saw the first match I remember seeing was Johnny Powers versus Antonio Inoki.
Wow.
And in Japan, they took things really seriously, more so than they ever did in the U.S., because before this match, they actually played the national anthem of each country, Johnny Powers for the U.S., Antonio Inoki for Japan. And it was very hard-hearing, very sports-oriented. And that was my first exposure to wrestling, in a way that I got hooked on it. And then when I got back to America, I discovered, wow, they have it here in America too. And that's where I first saw wrestling back when we only had 8 TV channels total, by the way. I mean, before cable TV, before pay-per-view. And by the way, TV ratings and pay-per-view, those are the main things that drive wrestling promotions today. Where back in the day, you only saw a certain wrestling promotion once a week for 1 hour, usually on some small UHF station. And the main purpose of that TV show was to sell tickets to your local arena show. That's it. They didn't have pay-per-view back then. They didn't have merchandise back then. That's all they had was the local house show at the local arena. And back in the day, it was the International Amphitheater in Chicago. I'm originally from the Chicagoland area in Illinois. So, and the first wrestling promotions I saw growing up, back when they had regional territories, that's another thing that's changed about the wrestling business. Now, nowadays in sports entertainment, I mean, the top guys are making more money than ever. But nowadays you have less guys making good money, or less guys actually making a living. Because back in the regional territory days, you had like at least 20, maybe 30 full-time wrestling promotions around the country where wrestlers can go and make a living. Where, for example, they would wrestle in Vern Gagne's AWA, and after a while, if they wanted to move on, or if they were getting stale, they could move on to a wrestling territory like The Florida office promoted by Eddie Graham, or Don Owens Pacific Northwest promotion, or NWA Georgia Championship Wrestling. There are more places where guys can get work, and also more places where guys can get experience too.
Yeah.
And in that way, I see a parallel between the wrestling business and the radio business. Nowadays in radio, it's more and more canned programming, syndicated programming, automated programming, where a lot of times at these stations which have dried up since I was first starting in the business, they have no need for live and local announcers, and even in some cases, no need for bore operators. And that's kind of scary when it comes to today's radio scene, because when I was first starting in radio, there were more smaller radio stations, just like the old territory system in wrestling, where you can gain experience, work at a smaller station, and then move up to another station where you actually get on-air experience and board operator experience. So you're very fortunate that you are working at an AM station in your area where you're actually allowed to board up and do some announcing. But anyway, so yeah, that was one of the differences between wrestling when I first started and today's wrestling scene. Well, today there's WWE, and now I'm thankful there's AEW, which is really giving WWE some much needed competition.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe a few other groups, ROH, TNA, or Impact nowadays. But back then there were like at least 20 different territories where guys can get work and get their feet wet. And when I first started watching wrestling in the Chicagoland area, there were two actually hometown promotions. There was Dick the Bruiser's WWA, Dick the Bruiser's World Wrestling Association, based out of Indiana, and there was Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association, which was based out of the Minnesota area and was shown throughout the Midwest. So those were the two home team promotions, so to speak, that I grew up on. And Chicago was a unique market because every monthly Chicago event at the International Amphitheater showcased guys from both promotions, Dick the Bruiser's WWA and Vern Gagne's AWA, and oftentimes you saw matchups pitting an AWA wrestler versus a WWA wrestler, kind of like a Super Bowl of wrestling every month. So that was kind of unique for us who lived in Chicago. And, I really liked the wrestling scene back then, but I like parts of it today still as well.
Okay. I want to ask you this. Did they crossed over from the WWA to AWA? Did you ever see any other territories that, might have, crossed over, like where guys versed each other? Because if, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but Ric Flair, didn't he take his NWA championship all over the place? So what were some other matchups that, you remember seeing from people in different territories?
Yeah, back when I grew up, there were three major world champions. There was Vern Gagne in the AWA, and there was, your territory's Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which became the World Wrestling Federation, and now it's World Wrestling Entertainment. That was your Northeast territory, and back in the day, it was either Bruno Sammartino or Bob Backlund back when I was growing up. And also there was the National Wrestling Alliance, which was held by Ric Flair and others before him, like Harley Race and others. And back then, the NWA, National Wrestling Alliance, they had different offices across the country, mainly in the South, mainly like Florida, Georgia, the Mid-Atlantic region, North Carolina, South Carolina, mainly in the South, and also maybe parts of the Midwest as well. But one unique market back in the regional territory days during the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, St. Louis was a very unique market where guys from all over the NWA territory came to wrestle each other. Guys from the different NWA offices, got together and formed kind of a Super Bowl of wrestling there as well in St. Louis, NWA St. Louis Wrestling. And Houston, Texas was kind of similar, where guys from the different NWA promotions got together and wrestled each other in Houston. So that was kind of a Super Bowl of wrestling situation as well. But for the most part, guys stayed in a regional territory for, a certain number of months, or there were some homesteaders in each territory as well. And the NWA champion, like Ric Flair, he would go to the different NWA territory, whether it was Georgia or Florida or Portland, Oregon, and he would take on that guy's top local guy, like maybe Bob Armstrong in NWA Alabama or in Georgia, whoever their top guy was at the time. And the job of the NWA World Champion back then, it was to make the local guy, the local challenger, look good.
Mm-hmm.
But NWA champion Ric Flair would still retain the title, but he would make the local top challenger look good in the process. So you don't kill that territory saying, oh, Ric Flair beat that guy so easily, and that would just kill the territory. No, Ric Flair and other NWA champions like Harley Race, they made the local top challenger look good while still retaining the NWA World Champion. But there's one thing that changed in 1984, when the World Wrestling Federation expanded nationwide. And, of course, the big guy they chose to be the face of the World Wrestling Federation was Hulk Hogan, who they got from the AWA. And in some people's eyes, especially in the eyes of old-school wrestling fans, Hulk Hogan kind of changed what a world champion is. Hulk Hogan's matches were kind of predictable, where you kind of knew Hulk would win each and every time with the exact same finish. Leg drop, 1, 2, 3, and he would come out looking like Superman. Whereas the other guys kind of looked possibly weaker by comparison, where Harley Race and Ric Flair holding the NWA title, they just barely retained their title, barely, while making the local challenger look good. So starting in 1984 with the World Wrestling Federation, that's kind of a different thing that was added on to how a world champion is perceived, with Hulk Hogan being the Superman world champion. So those are some of the ways that I've seen wrestling and how there have been changes over the years.
Yeah, they presented Hulk Hogan, in a completely different way. And, you were mentioning, of course, there's more of like a Hollywood feel to it. I feel like it kind of started with that. You had Hulk Hogan, presented as almost a superhero, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, all that good stuff. Then you kind of went back to the wrestling with Bret Hart. Then we get the anti-hero with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And you get these larger-than-life characters like The Rock. You got other characters on that roster, back in the Attitude Era, like Triple H, Kurt Angle. You had The Undertaker and Kane. You had all those different characters that became larger than life. And I feel like, in a way, it kind of started there. I mean, is that where you think it could have started?
Well, it was WWF, World Wrestling Entertainment, or back then it was World Wrestling Federation in 1984. Yeah, they're the ones who really magnified the entertainment part of pro wrestling. In fact, they don't even call it wrestling. They call it sports entertainment, I guess mainly as a way to appeal to advertisers in their mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think little by little, it was mainly WWF, World Wrestling Federation, that was kind of responsible for turning it more in the direction of sports entertainment while really playing up the entertainment aspect. And one thing I gave World Wrestling Federation credit for, they really upped their TV production values.
Yeah.
Back when I was watching during the 70s, they would hold TV wrestling tapings in some plain-looking space. Some would say it looked like somebody's basement with just a small audience of 20 people there on folding chairs.
Yeah.
And, the TV production values, slim to none in some people's minds. But, of course, as you know, World Wrestling Federation, they really enhanced the TV production to the point where TV executives at different TV stations around the country, they would just look at World Wrestling Federation's product from 1984 on, who maybe knew nothing about wrestling. They couldn't tell if a match was good or bad, but the TV production looked so impressive, it overrode even bad action in the ring. So in a way, that's how the World Wrestling Federation really influenced the future of what we now know as sports entertainment.
Yeah, I look at the matches from nowadays, and you look at them back in the 80s, they're slow moving. It almost looks like sloppy at times, and it's really kind of hard to watch, when you're used to matches from like nowadays moving so much faster. You got guys that can do all these different things athletically, have all different types of skills, with moving around when it comes to acrobatics, feats of strength, all those different kind of things. So I feel like it kind of like moves in a different sort of way. There's like a faster pace to it. I don't know if I don't know if faster is the right word, but the pacing is different, I think.
That is true. In fact, well, the pacing was different going back to the early 1900s. I'm talking like 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah.
Matches were even slower back then.
Mm.
You know, back during the days of Ed Strangler Lewis and other really old school old timers back in the day, where they would rest in a hold for a long time. You know, there was no such thing as high spots back then, no high flying, none of that. Just, you know, on the mat wrestling.
Yeah.
That's what it was. And then it's been said that Nature Boy Buddy Rogers kind of added high spots in wrestling, and his prime was, you know, during the 1940s and 50s, also the early 60s. So a lot of the moves that Buddy Rogers did, you know, they're taken for granted today, but back then, when he started, he was really innovative. So yeah, wrestling, it progresses, it gets faster and faster, and well, nowadays in entertainment in general, you know, young kids, they have lesser attention span. So yeah, you have to do a faster
that's
paced
true.
product in entertainment in general as well. So that's how wrestling and entertainment have you know, changed in that way. But I think there has to be a balance, because I still think that some of the principles in wrestling have to be applied, where it's not just what you do in the ring, it's when and how. There's
Yeah.
also psychology and storytelling in the ring that has to be put in the mix. Because I think, maybe with very few exceptions, if you just do high spot after high spot, you jump off of ladder, you jump off the balcony of a building, and after a while, the injuries will really add up.
Yeah.
In fact, one guy who worked in TV production said back in the day, you know, ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, you know, was hot back then, where guys
Yeah.
did all sorts of crazy things in the ring, and they used foreign objects on each other, and they did dangerous moves that could be crippling if not done correctly. And this production guy said the problem is these ECW guys, they're getting all banged up, and, you know, what are they going to look like when they retire? And something tells me they're going to retire much sooner than later. So I think, you know, there's a place for high spots, fancy moves in wrestling, but it has to be combined with storytelling, psychology. Why are you doing these moves? I think there has to be a good balance between, you know, storytelling in the ring and high spots when appropriate and needed.
Not only that, I think if you do high spot after high spot, like you mentioned, you know, people get used to it. You know, when it came to, I think, ECW, they had a way of introducing new different things. Paul Heyman is a marketing genius. You know, he introduced barbed wire matches. He had all kinds of different stars involved with this product. You know, you had Sandman swinging canes, smashing beers over his head. You had Rob Van Dam, who was throwing kicks and 5-star frog splashes. You had Zabu, suicidal, homicidal, throwing chairs into people, DDTing them through tables. So I feel like, you know, with that, there was so many different things brought to the table that it kind of kept the same thing. And I feel like, you know, like you mentioned, you got to have, you know, different things. It can't just be like high spot after high spot. You got to add different elements into your game, you know, maybe, you know, one powerful move, or, you know, a storyline that engages people, add something new to your character. I was just going off on what you said. I was in a little bit of a tangent right there.
Well, yeah, a couple of things off of what you just said. First of all, Paul Heyman, I've known him on and off over the years. I've interviewed him a couple of times in the past when I worked in radio, and, you know, thank God he said good things about me to other people, and that's a good thing, because maybe you've heard not so nice things about him behind the scenes, but he was always okay with me. And also, as far as the extreme stuff in ECW, you know, involving barbed wire matches and all that crazy ultra-violent stuff, I think ECW really made it visible across North America, but some of that stuff was used on a smaller or less visible level in some of the old regional territories back in the day, like Memphis, Tennessee, which was run by Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett. They had all sorts of crazy gimmick matches too. But also that's where FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling in Japan, got its influence, because the founder of Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling in Japan, Atsushi Onita, he, back in the territory days, wrestled for a while in Memphis. And when in Memphis, he was exposed to some of the so-called garbage wrestling gimmick matches, and he took some of that influence and he created his own promotion, FMW Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, which is extreme wrestling. And then I think that FMW wrestling influenced ECW. So maybe this has something to do with the old saying from the Word of God, there's nothing new under the sun. In other words, something originates from something else. So ECW, yeah, they kind of made it hip and popular, the extreme stuff, but it actually started somewhere else. And that's the good thing about knowing the history of wrestling.
Yeah, like you mentioned, all the Japanese death matches, FMW, I feel like Japan is where it might have started. I could be, like I said, 100% wrong. You've been the wrestling fan for years, so I don't know 100%, but yeah, like you said, there's nothing really new under the sun. But one thing I wanted to make sure I got to, and it's the nickname you had when you were in FMW. It's called Straight Up John Watanabe. And the reason why I wanted to ask you about it is because when we were talking about doing the show, this is actually something you told me yourself. This was the first thing you mentioned. So I wanted to ask why you were given that nickname since you told me about it.
Well, thankfully, that's something that I was allowed to come up with myself, and it was okayed by the people around me. I don't know if it started in either FMW, presented by Tokyo Pop, or the Urban Wrestling Alliance, but I used that moniker Straight Up John Watanabe in both promotions because I would say on the air here and there, I call the action straight up down the middle.
Okay.
Impartial, to maintain credibility. And that is one of the problems I have when it comes to things scripted out word for word in some of today's product because, well, maybe some of the talent like wrestlers and valets and, behind-the-scenes actors, maybe they're okay with scripted out words for them. Maybe they're comfortable in that environment. But I feel as a wrestling announcer, play-by-play guy who has to call the action objectively, it's better if it comes spontaneously from me or whoever is doing the play-by-play announcing. Because some people may say, well, actors go by scripts. They got words in front of them. That's true, but when you're playing an actor in a film or a TV show, you're playing a character, a different character, or that's not you. But when you're a wrestling play-by-play announcer, you should be able to call the action spontaneously from your own heart, the way you see it, call it as it is, because if you put somebody else's words, well, there's action in front of me, it doesn't come out sincere, and it lacks credibility. So, thankfully, thank God, I was able to do my own thing with the non-scripted FMW videos and also with the Urban Wrestling Alliance, even though the Urban Wrestling Alliance had a staff of TV writers. In fact, one of the writers was also a writer for the Steve Harvey Show.
Yeah.
They wrote jokes and some very unusual stuff, but they got the hint right away that all I needed were bullet points. So they gave me bullet points, and then I just called the action straight up down the middle from there, and I thank God I was able to do that.
Yeah, I feel like the other guy, I think his name was like Cross or something. He was a rapper, right?
Yes, he was. Yeah, and that was another part of the audition process where they did auditions for the Urban Wrestling Alliance. Thankfully, they chose me as the play-by-play guy, the main host on camera. But then they also auditioned for a color commentator to be with me. So then they had like a second round of auditions where it was me calling matches on a TV monitor with a different guy sitting next to me to be my color commentator. And I auditioned with different guys taking turns to be my color commentator for the UWA. And then they chose a guy named Sean Martin who goes by the name Cross. And yeah, he was a rapper for Rough Riders Entertainment, and his wrestling knowledge was slim to none. But he was there to carry the interest in the hip-hop community aspect of the Urban Wrestling Alliance, where he threw out rap references, hip-hop references, and he knew all these hip-hop artists, so that was his role with the UWA.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's some radio questions that I want to ask you as well. So I'm going to segue into that really quick. You were at a bunch of different radio stations in your career. When we talked before the show, you mentioned the station you started off at was WFXW, excuse me, 1480 in Geneva, Illinois. And you told me that had significance for a few reasons. I wanted to wait to ask you what those reasons were on the show because I wanted to be able to learn them. So, what are those reasons?
Well, I guess first of all, when I look back, I worked at a half dozen different radio stations in Illinois when I was first starting out during the 1980s and 90s. And most of those stations, except for one, the country music station in Rockford, Illinois, they no longer exist, most of those stations.
Wow.
Nowadays, I think they're all like automated with no need for live talent and in some cases no need for even board operators. They just stream automated programming nonstop and that's it. But AM 1480 WFXW in Geneva, I'm thankful that it was a full service station, which means you got to do a bit of everything.
Yeah.
Where you got to do your own quote-unquote DJ show playing adult contemporary music. That was their format. But you got to read local news. You got to bring guests on. And you did a bit of everything where it's been said when you first start out in radio, you could do one or two approaches. You could either go to a big market station and dust floors or go to a very small market station and do everything.
Yeah.
And that was a place where I did everything. So I'm very thankful for that. And back then, one of the management people said, if you get a job here, you can do any job from here on. And to a certain extent, I agree with that because you pretty much did everything there. And it was 2 years ago when the Geneva History Museum did a special event. Yeah, they actually do have a history museum in the small town of Geneva, Illinois, because they have some historic landmarks, including this Dutch windmill that's been around since the 1850s. So they have a history museum there. And they had this one-day event where they had the history of radio in Geneva, Illinois, where they had guest speakers, and the audience consisted of people from the public. And the director of the Geneva History Museum asked me, she wanted me to be a part of it, either as a guest speaker in person or over the internet. I couldn't do either one at the time. So what I did instead was I wrote a letter on stationery from my current radio workplace, K-Wave, and I told them my story about how I got my start here and how it was a good launching pad for my 30-plus years in radio and television, including being a nationally seen pro wrestling announcer. So I'm thankful for the start that WFXW gave me. You know, God bless, thanks for listening. And I was told that they read my article, or my letter rather, out loud to everybody in attendance. And then Terry Emma, the director of the History Museum, said, John, thank you so much for sharing your letter with us, your story of success that first started here in Geneva, Illinois. And we're going to keep your letter. We're going to preserve your letter in the archives, so it'll be on display at the History Museum for anybody who wants to learn about the history of Geneva. So I'm thankful for that. And also, it was at WFXW in Geneva where I think I had the best interviews with wrestlers during the time I interviewed wrestlers earlier in my career. I did it before and after WFXW, but I think the top three favorite interviews I did with wrestling people were at WFXW. One was with Kurt Hennig, who was then the AWA World Champion. Whoa. He later became known as Mr. Perfect.
Yeah. And
he was very good, and he was willing to give advice to guys who wanted to start out in wrestling, so that was very nice of him. Another interview I did was, my first one actually, was with Paul E. Dangerously, who is now known as Paul Heyman. You know, to this day, he never breaks kayfabe. You know, behind the scenes, he'll say, John, you're a good guy. I'm so thankful you're doing this with me. But then on the air, he'll go, John, you're a punk and I don't like you. I mean, always kayfabe, you know, always stay in character. That's one of the funny things about him. And he still understands that. He might be one of the few guys who still maintains kayfabe or still stays in character to this day. And, well, in a way, being an old school guy, I kind of appreciate that.
Yeah.
And the third interview I did at WFXW in the studios there was with the late legendary Ox Baker. Ox Baker is perhaps best known to non-wrestling fans for being this big, bald-headed guy with a bushy mustache who fought Kurt Russell in the movie Escape from New York. Did you see that movie?
I think so, but it's been a while. You might have to refresh my memory.
Yeah, well, anyway, Ox Baker, he was the big monstrous guy who fought Kurt Russell in that movie
Okay.
with Foreign Objects. But Ox was a real character. I mean, he was a dreaded bad guy back in the day during the 1970s, and he was the master of the heart punch.
Okay.
Yeah, that was his big move where he punched the guy in the heart, and the guy would fall down, and that was it. 1, 2, 3. That was his big finisher. And Ox was quite a character. Even other people in the business will tell you Ox was quite a character. He was this mean guy who had a big booming voice and who would threaten guys on camera for TV wrestling interviews. But behind the scenes, he was a real laughable clown. He joked around a lot, and he made people laugh. In fact, when he was at the studios at WFXW in Geneva, he asked me, "Do you got any food here?" So I gave him some popcorn, a bag of popcorn we had, and then he ate this popcorn like the Cookie Monster. And then, he got popcorn all over the console, all over the floor. And then Ox looked at me and said, "Hey, John, you got a messy floor here." So that was kind of funny.
I love it.
And so those were good memories I had where I was involved in wrestling. And also, WFXW Radio in Geneva, Illinois, that's how I first got involved in local ring announcing.
Okay.
Now, because when I was at WFXW, that's when I called Gary Juster, who was, one of the big promoters for the National Wrestling Alliance. He promoted shows, local house shows in the Midwest and the Northeast. And he was, of course, involved behind the scenes for many years for NWA and WCW. And I just called Gary Juster from the NWA because I simply wanted to interview wrestlers like I normally did. And then out of the blue, Gary Juster asked me, "Have you ever done ring announcing?" And I said, "No." But then Gary said, "But you've seen it 1,000 times." I go, "Yeah." And he knew I was a genuine wrestling fan and I had broadcasting experience. So he asked me to do some local ring announcing from then on. And that's how I got to do ring announcing, introducing guys like the Road Warriors and the Russian Bear Ivan Koloff and Dick Murdoch and many others. So that was a fun experience. And it's been said that, ring announcing, it's a way to get involved in bigger and better things within the wrestling business. So I guess in a way it was kind of a stepping stone. It looked good on a resume for me, where I had ring announcing on my resume, which eventually led me to do pro wrestling, hosting, and play-by-play announcing for these national companies. So for that, I'm very thankful.
Yeah, it certainly couldn't have hurt. That's definitely true. You mentioned kayfabe really quick, and one thing that I want to talk to you about when it comes to breaking kayfabe, because I hear it a lot in all these, recent interviews that The Undertaker has been going on, since that pulling back of the curtain that he finally did, because he's an old school guy, from Mean Mark Callis to, his days on the independent scene, from the time he had in WWE, turning down movie roles, being careful of where he went because he didn't want people to notice, he was out and just a regular person. I mean, the pulling back of the curtain, I think, with that has been just so dramatic that, it's mind-boggling to see him on, all these interviews. And that's one thing I've noticed, recently, especially with kayfabe, the impact that has because, he was in that character for 30 years.
Yeah, that's another way that the business has changed over the years. Well, I think during the past 20 years or so, entertainment in general has gotten more reality-based. And also with the internet out there, which we didn't have back in the regional territory days during the 80s, more and more information, inside information is getting out there. So that's another way that the business has changed over the years. And yeah, back in the territory days, the promoters, they really drilled it into the boys. You got to maintain kayfabe, stay in character. The good guys don't mingle with the bad guys. Because if a good guy or baby face was in a heated blood feud with a heel or bad guy, and if they were seen in public together partying, having a good time together, that would ruin the whole illusion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why kayfabe, and that would ruin the box office. So I'm not coming to this fake show if these guys are really friends in real life. So that was something that was really protected back in the day, kayfabe or staying in character, making it look like their storyline characters were the way they really were in real life. So that's another way that the business has changed.
Yeah.
And I think it took a while for a guy like The Undertaker. He started in the old territory system, so after being drilled into in him, I think it finally, got more relaxed as he saw that things were getting more reality based. So okay, I guess I could pull back the curtain now, as
Yeah.
opposed to way back when. And another thing about The Undertaker, since you brought The Undertaker,
Yeah.
I remember when he first started as a rookie. It's not well publicized, but
Yeah.
people say that his first match was with World Championship Wrestling, the Von Erichs territory. That's
No.
not exactly true. Maybe that was his big nationwide debut, but before that he toiled in indies. In fact, back in 1987 or 88, there was this one small-time promoter I talked to who promoted this rinky-dink league called Central Illinois Wrestling, and which promoted in like high schools, small spot shows back in the day in Illinois. And he said at the time over the phone to me that he had this big guy, 6'5", 300 pounds, and he's named the Commando.
Yeah, that's what he started as, right?
And at the time I said, well, so what? And he would make the trips from Texas to Illinois and back just to wrestle in this rinky-dink promotion called CI, or Central Illinois Wrestling. Little did I know that he would become the great phenomenon known as The Undertaker.
God, that's amazing. I actually watched one of the interviews I watched with him. He went on, I don't know if you know the YouTube show called Hot Ones. They brought that up on there. And I was like, wait, he used to be named the Commando? That's mind-boggling, because I remember him as Mean Mark Callis. I remember that. I had no idea that, he was called something like the Commando when he was starting out. But wow, that's crazy that you mentioned that he went from like Texas to Illinois too. Because I've done road trips like that, when I've been doing stand-up. I'll go to like the Mohegan Sun in Connecticut, which is a 4-hour, 5-hour drive for me. Or I might do the Elbow Room in like West Hartford over there or something. So it just brought, a little bit of those drives back for me,
Yeah, that's what you got to do if you're paying your dues in anything. You take any opportunity, regardless of how low the pay is or regardless of how far away it is. If you want a credit on your resume, you go for it if you're just starting out to get your feet wet. And, that was one of the issues with, pro wrestling territories back in the day, but maybe also with indie wrestling nowadays.
Okay.
Well, there are these small independent promotions nowadays that pay little to nothing. The guys are just getting exposure and experience, but that's what you got to do when you're starting out.
Yeah.
And when you're first starting out in the radio business, you take jobs that maybe pay minimum wage or don't pay much at all. And, you just get your feet wet. You gain all the experience you can. You learn from other people. You learn what not to do. And, when you make some mistakes in a smaller market station, you know what not to do when you move on to the next bigger and better thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's what you got to do when you pay your dues.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I want to bring this up because I'm going to switch back to radio for just a quick second. This is just a bit of a fun fact, because you used to work at a station in Aurora, Illinois, and there was an episode that I did. This happened a couple of years ago now, but I had on another Illinois native, a guy who's currently the head coach of the Aurora University football team, former NFL wide receiver Don Beebe. I had him on the show, I think, early 2019, and he was a really, really fun guy to talk to, I just thought it was really cool that you worked in that city, and I had, the head coach, the current head coach of that college on here. I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and for some people listening, there is such a town as Aurora, Illinois. Some people only know it from the movie Wayne's World, those two geeky guys who did this show in their basement from Aurora, Illinois. But hey, there actually is an Aurora, Illinois on the map. And WKKD in Aurora, I think it still exists under a different format though, but I'm not sure how much of their programming is live. Very little. I think a lot of it is automated. But WKKD, that was another station where I got my feet wet. And back then, it was like very soft adult contemporary music. They would play some current Mariah Carey. They also played some Johnny Mathis and Barry Manilow and some instrumental stuff by David Sanborn. So really soft, easy listening kind of stuff. And yeah, I like all kinds of music too. And that's another thing. I'm blessed and thankful that I've been versatile in the radio business, where I've worked all sorts of different formats, like soft adult contemporary, like I said, also top 40, country music, oldies music. I've worked all these different formats, and that's a blessing because you're available for more job opportunities that way, because some guys are pigeonholed where people might think, oh, he's just a classic rock guy, or he's just an NPR public radio guy, or he can only do this one delivery, he can only do that one format. But I'm thankful and blessed that I've been able to do all these different formats, being versatile, and I equate it to being an actor who is able to do comedy or drama or action adventure or musicals, a wide variety of roles, instead of being typecast or stereotyped or pigeonholed into just one type of part, and that's it. Because you're really, it becomes really limiting in that way, whereas if you're more versatile, there are more job opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. I like the fact, that this, the station I'm at has me doing sports news, current news. I can have conversations over at this station where, I just talk to different people in a longer format. So I definitely relate to that blessing 100%. But I do want to switch gears one more time. You mentioned that, between 1998 and 2003, you took a break from radio because you were doing TV commercials. You landed your commentating jobs during that time. And you also moved to California, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, around that time. Were the commercials, just something you wanted to do because you needed to make some extra money for the move, or, was that something you actually wanted to get into?
I think it's one of the many things in entertainment that I wanted to do, which I'm thankful I have done. Well, I'm thankful I've done radio work. I'm thankful I've done professional stage acting work, which I did in Chicago and here in California as well. And I'm thankful I've done TV commercials. They're all in the realm of broadcasting and entertainment, and I'm thankful I've been able to do them all. And since you mentioned it, it was in 1998 when I moved from Illinois, the Chicago area, to Hollywood, California, Southern California. Because I'm thankful I gained experience in Chicago and surrounding areas. In Chicago, I did, along with radio, I did some local TV commercials, and I did some corporate videos, which is the bulk of the work that's available in Chicago, by the way, corporate videos or industrials when it comes to on-camera work. Also, I did professional stage acting. I acted especially in a number of professional children's theater programs, which paid pretty well. And also, the thing about children's theater, it was very interactive and very improvisational. So I got to interact with the audiences, and that really helps when you do any kind of live performing or pro wrestling announcing as well. Anyway, I moved in 1998 because I landed my first Los Angeles talent agent even before I moved to California, because while I still lived in Illinois, I took part in a one-week out-of-towner showcase where they had guest speakers, casting directors from Los Angeles and LA talent agents, and all these people were legit. If you look them up on imdb.com and other credible resources, you'll see them listed on there with credit. So these were credible industry people. And also, we actors, including myself from out of town, we got to perform on stage doing different things. And then when I performed, that's where my first LA talent agent saw me, Paula Sorensen from Coast to Coast Talent in Los Angeles, which still exists. Paula told me, hey, I like your look, I like your comic acting ability. As soon as you move out here to California, we'll sign you up. So that gave me incentive to make the next big leap from Chicago to Hollywood to Los Angeles, California. And I'm thankful I had something to make me want to move, because some people move from out of state to Hollywood with nothing lined up.
Yeah.
But I got a head start by having a Los Angeles talent agent ahead of time. So that was a blessing right there, a head start. And then once I moved to California, shortly after that, I got some pretty good work. Like I said, I did TV commercials. And also within the first few months, I got my SAG eligibility for the Screen Actors Guild within a few months. which was something because some people out here, they've done crowd scene extra work for years, maybe decades, and they still don't have SAG eligibility. Whereas I did one principal job for a TV commercial I did, a national spot. It was for Simon Mall Management, and it was shot at a shopping mall, and it was casted by Sheila Manning Casting, and it was through my commercial talent agent, Paula Sorensen from Coast to Coast. And so I got that, but I might as well tell you another industry thing, but even though I got the eligibility to join SAG, the way it was, and maybe the way it is still nowadays, you're eligible to join the Screen Actors Guild either by doing a bunch of extra work, but that's not the way to go because I don't recommend extra work. Maybe once or twice if you're really beginning, to get your feet very wet, if you're not familiar with camera work at all, doing work in front of a camera. But after a while, if you do too much extra work, you'll perceive what is the equivalent of a jobber in pro wrestling, where you're just a loser. Whereas if you do extra work, it's been said in the industry, an extra is not an actor. An extra is a prop that eats. That's all. But which is why it's important to get legit acting training and, legit time on stage where you're doing a real meaty lead role and put that on a resume instead of, writing crowd scene extra 200 in this movie. No, forget it.
Yeah.
So anyways, the other way to get Screen Actors Guild eligibility is if you do 2 principal jobs for the Screen Actors Guild. And then after that, you can join. But Paula Sorensen, my first commercial talent agent in Los Angeles, told me some good advice. Don't join right away for the sake of joining the Screen Actors Guild union because right now you could do both non-union and union jobs, and you'll get more opportunities that way working with both. You'll get more contacts, more experiences, and it worked out well that way for me. But after I did my second principal job for the Screen Actors Guild, I think it was for some national TV commercial out here in Los Angeles, I decided to go Financial Core, which is perfectly legal according to the Screen Actors Guild. Financial Core means you're a dues-paying non-member, which means you still get the same money if you do union jobs for SAG, but you don't have to. But what the thing is, you still get the same money if you're a dues-paying non-member for SAG or Financial Core. If you're Financial Core, you don't get so-called benefits like you can't do SAG volunteer work, you can't vote in SAG elections, you can't run for SAG office. Quite frankly, there's a so-called benefits that I could do without, okay?
Yeah.
So I could do without those. So anyway, so I'm thankful I got my feet wet in Los Angeles. Well, actually, more than wet, I got some pretty good work doing TV commercials. So yeah, that was a part of what I wanted to do. And also, when I first moved out here to California, I studied and did improv on stage, improvisation. That's, if you're familiar with the TV show, Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Yeah.
That's, improvisation. And so I did that. I studied improv under 2 sets of people. I studied improv under the late, great Avery Schreiber, who was a well-known comedian on national television during the 60s and 70s. Your grandparents would recognize him easily. He was a part of a comedy team called Burns and Schreiber, Jack Burns and Avery Schreiber. One of their ongoing comedy bits when they would say back and forth to each other, yeah, huh, yeah, huh, yeah, huh, yeah, huh. That was one of their bits. Also, Avery Schreiber did famous commercials for Doritos tortilla chips where he would crunch them. You had to see them. They're on YouTube.
Really?
So that was what he was well known for. And he was, not only a good improv teacher, and he had experience with Second City in Chicago, did national TV work, film work, but he was a good mentor. He gave good, comforting advice. Don't be discouraged if you don't get a part for this audition because, it'll just make you get closer and closer to the real good part that's better suited for you and your gifts. And also I studied improv under the Second City alumni team of Jeff Bachelski and his wife Jane Morris. They've done all sorts of character work here in Hollywood, TV and films, where I got to study improv with them, and I got to perform on stage at the Comedy Underground in Santa Monica week after week. So that was good ongoing training that kept my skills sharp, my thinking skills sharp, because improv, it helps to make you be quick on your feet. not just when doing stage improvisation in front of an audience, but also if you're at an audition. Improv helps in audition situations, and it helps on the radio when you're live, and it helps when it comes to doing play-by-play announcing for wrestling, because it makes you think on your feet, and it really keeps you sharp in that way. So those are some of the things I've done here in California. And also, California is where I met my beautiful blonde school teacher wife, April. So I'm thankful for that. California has been a plus when it comes to my personal life, my marriage, and when it comes to my professional career as well.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it did a lot of good for you. So, being at all the stations that you have in Illinois and everything you've done in California, how is the experience different between those two states? Because I'm sure there's some differences.
Well, for my own experiences, starting out in the Chicago area, Chicago and surrounding areas in the suburbs, well, it's for me at least, it was an okay place to get started when it comes to doing on-camera work, especially, but there's a limited amount of work compared to Hollywood and Los Angeles. I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Where the bulk of the work in Chicago, it was mainly industrials or corporate videos. And also some commercials here and there, mainly local TV commercials. And a lot of the work there is non-union, which is fine. But if you want to do union stuff that may really add more exposure, Hollywood or Los Angeles is the place to be. But I'm thankful Chicago is the place to get my start. And it certainly helped my resume to build up a resume with experience with, local Chicago TV commercials and corporate videos, as well as some, professional stage acting for children's theater shows at the Jack Benny Center in Waukegan in Illinois. That was a really historic venue named after the great comedian Jack Benny in his hometown of Waukegan, Illinois. But after a while, I felt I had to move on to California, where there's just bigger and better things. And I've heard this from at least one entertainer who moved from Canada to Los Angeles. I mean, in Canada, it was a place to get a start, but after a while, there's just limited money and limited opportunities. And, after a while, you just have to move on or, take a chance. Of course, not everybody who moves to Hollywood will make it, obviously, but, sometimes you just have to take a chance and, try it out. And if it's not for you, then just go back and do something else to wherever you're from. But thank God I took the chance, and, thank God I got, bigger and better things, nationally seen pro wrestling jobs, and I'm very thankful for that. And if I didn't make the move, you never would have even known me as the national pro wrestling announcer for FMW and the Urban Wrestling Alliance. So I'm thankful I made the move.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, and if you don't do it, the guarantee is it's not going to happen. Just like if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So, that makes a lot of sense. So I have two more questions, and these two are wrestling based. So John Corrigan from the Wrestling Estate, both a good friend of both of ours, so shout out to John Corrigan, the editor-in-chief of the Wrestling Estate. He did an article on you, and, you mentioned this already, but there's one thing in the article that mentions that you believe having knowledge of wrestling history and personality when you're announcing, they're both important. If you had to pick one, and this is just something that, I'm wondering as a commentator, which do you think is more important? If you had to pick, is it the wrestling history or is it the personality?
Okay, the wrestling history or the personality?
If one had to be more important.
Well, first and foremost, I think that has to be a mix, but it might depend. If you are shooting to work for World Wrestling Federation or World Wrestling Entertainment, Sports Entertainment, it might not matter as much if you have wrestling knowledge. In fact, that's one thing during the 80s when they expanded nationally. A lot of times they didn't even acknowledge wrestling history. They thought, oh, we're the only guys doing it. So wrestling history has never been that important in WWE. However, for other groups that have more hardcore audiences who are real wrestling fans, not just casual observers of sports entertainment, and that's it, wrestling history knowledge and knowledge, of wrestling might matter more if you're starting out in small independents or groups that may be more hardcore in their approach, like Ring of Honor or other groups, where the fans are really serious about wrestling and where they really care about wrestling knowledge. In those situations, having wrestling knowledge, including knowledge of history, may be more important. So it might depend on what groups you're shooting for, but that's the way I see it.
Yeah, no, that was just one thing that I was curious about, and I wanted to make sure that I asked it. But I think the other thing that I want to ask you before we got to wrap up the show, because I know these guys want to get out of here, is if there's anything, you still want to do when it comes to radio, maybe announcing at some point if you wanted to step back in that, or something else. What is it you would still want to do in the future?
Well, that's a good question, and by the way, just to add a side note to the question you previously asked me, when I say that it's important to have personality and on-camera presence and the ability to work in front of an audience and wrestling knowledge, I say this because I think it's indicated in that article. One of the people who auditioned for the FMW Tokyo Puck job, he had wrestling knowledge and experience as a wrestler, but he just had no personality.
Yeah.
No stage presence, no on-camera savvy, none of that. So that's why having that ability to perform in front of an audience, in front of a camera especially, does matter in situations like that if you have no personality. But anyway, I am blessed and thankful for all that I have done. I would be open to doing wrestling announcing again, even though it's not top priority.
Yeah.
But it's so funny you mentioned it because now my wife and I were already thinking about retirement plans. Thinking about maybe settling down in some area where it's more cozy, where we can just enjoy life, still be active in the community in some way, in fact, involved with church, but just relax a little bit more. But I will say this. When I retire, God willing, I'd be willing to stay in radio part-time, working very part-time at a radio station, not full-on full-time, but just part-time as a way to help out here and there, maybe to help out younger guys starting out, to pass on my knowledge to them, and just a way to keep my mind going and to stay active. So that's one thought I have in mind, but we'll see where the Lord leads.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. I feel like I wouldn't want to, just because, I love what I do, so it's not really like work to me. Like, this isn't work. When I go do color commentary for WBCB, I enjoy it. It's not work. You know what I mean?
And that's a good attitude to have. I mean, I can tell you that you're hungry, you're enthusiastic, so that tells me that you want to stick with this for a while.
Yeah.
And after a while, if you've been doing it for a long time, if that thrill is gone, if you're not enthusiastic about it anymore, whether it be acting or wrestling announcing or being on the radio, if it just feels like a job going through the motions, and if you don't have that drive and enthusiasm anymore, then maybe that's the time to hang it up and, be thankful for the time you did, but maybe that's the time to hang it up. But in the meantime, sounds like you're really enthusiastic, and I admire that. And I admire that you're willing to learn, to gain knowledge from those who have been there and done that. And with those attributes, with that attitude, I think you have a bright future ahead.
For sure, and I appreciate that. You actually got me thinking of one more thing, though. Do you feel like, you've done some of the things you've done, go from radio to TV commercials to commentary to back to radio. Do you ever feel like you did those things because you needed that change of pace? Were you thinking that at the time? Is it something you realized later? Have you ever felt like that?
If I just needed a change of pace, and what else?
If you just needed like a change of pace or to like do something different,
Well, I'm not sure if there was ever a time when I said, I don't like doing this anymore, I'll do this different thing now. I don't think that was ever the case. I just really wanted to try out different things all at once, whether it be professional stage acting or improvisation, radio announcing, TV commercials, pro wrestling announcing. I just enjoyed doing all those things. I wanted to try all of them as soon as I could, and I'm thankful I did them when I did, because some of those opportunities are no longer there. Because some of the radio stations I worked at, they no longer exist, and and some wrestling groups, they no longer exist either. So, while the opportunity is there, and thank God there were openings, that's when I went after them, knowing that I would at least have a chance to be a part of them. And then when I auditioned for all these things, I thank God I got through that door and I got to do them. So I'm thankful I did them while I could. But as I said, if you don't feel as enthusiastic about one as you do for the other, then that's the time to, okay, I'll cut out the one and I'll go after this other thing that I'm really gunning for. So that's my outlook.
Okay, gotcha. I just wanted to make sure I asked you that since the thought was in my head. But, I know these guys want to get out of here. Ruben, give him one more shout out. He does a great job over here. I normally don't thank him this much. You're having me be really nice to Ruben, which is something that I'm not used to. And I'm probably not going to do again anytime soon. But thank you for bringing that out of me. I appreciate it. And once again, thank you for coming on and having this conversation with me and being on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you, John Brecko. Thank you again, Ruben. And a shout out to John Corrigan. Thank you all. God bless.
God bless, man. You have a good rest of your night, okay?
All right, you too.
All right, bye.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, everybody. That was straight up John Watanabe here on Hamilton Radio. Really, really good to talk to that guy for the first time. I really appreciated having him on. I got to learn a lot from an old school wrestling fan. We'll be back same time, same channel next week, everybody. Deuces.
Everybody riot, organized chaos, nobody quiet. We gon' try a seance. Communication and communion with the world's greatest icon. Station as a human, yet he's listening to my song. Hype join. This that no nigga with the bass and the bang. Make it do, yo. Hit you with the 5 elements, like 5 elephants. Let him know I'm relevant. I'm heaven sent, telling him we're from a whole nother galaxy. I'm actually born from the